Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Esoterica. I'm Leah Eichler, and today we have the distinct pleasure of interviewing Terry Fallis. Terry is, oh my goodness, he has a long list of accomplishments. When I was reading your bio earlier, I'm thinking Terry is the Renaissance man that we were. It was in our midst. Studied engineering, was in the government as well, you can tell me all about your liberal experience in the liberal government and all your advocacy there, and now a best-selling novelist of 8 books. I mean, literally like clockwork. Every 2 years I think a new one comes out. You are a master. And Susan and I both finished reading
Yes, it's a copy of
Operation
the book.
Angus. We have our props like in 2 days. I mean, neither of us could put it down. So now with that intro, welcome, Terry.
Well, thanks so much. What a kind interview. So good of you to read the novels. I mean, so often you get interviewed by folks and they haven't read the novel or any of your novels. So very kind of you. Thank you.
Well,
I'm
it's
delighted to be
truly
here.
a pleasure to read. I don't think I've kind of just for sheer enjoyment of, just having a smile on my face the whole time I was reading it. And I was telling Leah, like, about partway through, I started to feel like I was like in really safe hands, where you're like, I know I'm going to enjoy the rest of this book. I know the plot's going to be very satisfying. I know I'm going to like the characters. I'm not too worried that something is going to happen that's meant to, so many books you read, you're like, they try to make it falsely significant usually by killing a child or something like that. I'm like, that's not going to happen here.
Had that conversation before,
Yes.
that.
Yes, I would not be very good at including a murdered child in any of
No.
my novels, but
Yes.
but thank you. I'm glad. I'm delighted.
Yeah.
So I need to know. There's so many things I want to know. I mean, sorry, I meant to say you started out before your career as a best-selling novelist, as a liberal strategist, and your engineering background, and somehow you weave all of that into your fiction, which is really brilliantly done. I mean, I was telling Susan, it's almost as if this book was structured by an engineer. I mean, the structure is perfect, like really, like so perfect. So tell us how you bring all your previous lives into your current writing life.
Well, it largely is rooted in my my disinterest in doing research. So I like to plumb the depths of my own experiences in my own life. So I'm a member in good standing of the Write What You Know school of writing. I think writers strive to write with authority and conviction and authenticity. And how better to do that than to draw upon your own experiences without the novels, any of my novels, being autobiographical in any way. They're really not autobiographical, but I know those worlds well. And it just makes it easier for me to write about them in a way that I hope is compelling and rings true and connects with the reader when I've experienced some of those episodes myself.
I mean, I'll let Susan go because I have more follow-up questions. I don't want to hog you at the interview subject.
Well, I wondered about, it is in some ways a workplace novel. And what do you think about, when you are setting a book in a workplace with all the personalities that are involved? How do you make sure it's entertaining and yet reflective of the real life office politics? And were the office politics you encountered as kind of fraught and ego-driven as the ones we see in Operation Angus?
Oh yeah, I think it definitely was. I worked in the mid '80s on Parliament Hill. My first job out of university was on Jean Chrétien's staff for the '84 leadership campaign, and I would have done that on a volunteer basis without being paid at all. In fact, I wasn't even looking for a job, but I was offered one, and I said yes, I'll take that experience. Thank you. So I have been in those smoke-filled back rooms, although they don't really have smoke in them. but I have been
more, I imagine.
Yeah, that's right. but I have been in the back rooms, and in politics in particular, there is an awful lot of ego, and there are people trying to make their mark, to put their own stamp on things, and not wishing to miss an opportunity to climb another rung on the ladder. So perhaps more so, well, maybe not, but at least as much as in most other workplaces, because power seems to be something that drives a lot of the people who work in that nether world of politics. And I arrived in Ottawa much more interested in policy than in politics. Frankly, back then, I didn't understand the distinction between the two, but I learned quite quickly. So I think you will find that the workplace is accurately portrayed. However, perhaps some of the characters' personality traits have been torqued just a little bit for comedic effect, but not enough for it to be unrealistic. There are some people there who behave in that way, and some of those characters are archetypes, and politics overflows with archetypes, and the Bradley Stanton character, the power mongering chief of staff who really is only interested in power and doesn't really care about policy or what we might actually achieve as a government. They're just much more interested in politics and sticking it to the opposition and sustaining a lead in the polls and all of that. So that was an easy character to portray because there are so many models for it.
Yes.
And that's how that world works. And then you have the policy wonks on the other side who don't really understand how politics works often. But that's a problem because they can't get their vaunted ideas over the finish line, because you do need to wrestle with the realities of politics if you want to move something across the finish line in the House of Commons. So I had fun pulling it together, and it really hasn't changed that much. I had hoped that it would have changed. In fact, I wrote my first two novels in a way as a handbook for how we might change politics, illuminating a different path we might take, born out of my frustration and almost bitterness with how we practice politics. I sort of arrived on Parliament Hill fresh-faced and ready to serve, and then the relentless tide of politics kind of beats that public service calling out of you. So those first two novels were, yes, they're political satire, but I think of them as satire because there is a broader purpose. And I hoped readers might enjoy the story and laugh, but I'd be more fulfilled if they gave passing thought to some of the issues that underlie the fun. And now Operation Angus is a little bit different. I don't think of it as a political satire. It's more of a comic thriller of sorts.
It is. Well, actually, it's interesting. What struck me about it is, and it's so Canadian, and not because it takes place in Ottawa, and not because it revolves around Parliament Hill and the politics of Parliament Hill, but just the personality types are almost stereotypically what we'd like to portray to the world of who Canadians are, and you really capture those people. I mean, this is how I think people outside of Canada view Canada, and I think it's actually how we in our best moments like to view ourselves, right?
Right. I don't disagree. And the voice and the humor, I think I'm not even sure I can explain it, but I believe that there is a sort of Canadian sense of humor that is different, perhaps only subtly, from the senses of humor you have in other countries, particularly in the United States or in Britain. Regardless of where my novels are set, I am a Canadian. I've lived all of my 62 years, which I find hard even to enunciate out loud, that it's been that long, in Canada. So I don't think I could write something that didn't have a Canadian tinge to it, if only for the voice and the sense of humor. But.
Oh, and before just and you somehow managed to give two elderly women hero positions in the in a book. I mean, that is quite the feat. I mean, women actually that are already in, in a retirement home setting,
Yes.
whose brilliance is so, they're so capable that they actually single-handedly almost save the day. I don't want to give away too much, but I mean, it's tell us a little bit about that, because you don't see a lot of older women portrayed in those kinds of roles. So how did you end up pulling that off?
Well, I was very active in the student movement in my university years, and spent a number of years working in that world. I was president of the Students' Union at McMaster, and on the, at all the national conferences, and involved in all of that. And there is a very prominent feminist strand that runs through the national student movement, and I just became quite what's the word? I was seized by that issue, even though I hail from the most privileged demographic in the history of human civilization, the middle-aged white male. But I'm also an engineer, and the numbers spoke to me that over half the population of the world is affected on a daily basis, to a great extent, sometimes to a harrowing, life-threatening extent, and other times maybe not so much. But women face challenges every day, and equality is still a distant goal, despite the great strides we've made. So that's been a social issue, a cause that I sort of took on as my chosen cause, 30 years ago or more. Well, no, 40 years ago, sorry. So, and I realized when I was writing these novels that older women tend to disappear in our literature.
So true.
And, you read, there are some, but there aren't that many Canadian novels, or any novels for that matter, where older women take their rightful place, and their wisdom and years of experience and insight seems to be sacrificed, and they fade into the background. So with my first novel, and all through all of my novels, I have tried to portray older women in positions of leadership and strength and power and influence, that are playing a role in the story beyond, the ornamental, well, we better put an older woman in just to round out our demographic complement. That wasn't the interest. I want them to play important roles. So that's a long-winded way of saying that's why I have older women in this novel, as I have I think there's, in almost all of them, there's an older woman who plays an important role in the story. So it's sort of my one writer crusade to restore the luster to older women's role in Canadian literature.
That's great.
I think you did a great job.
Yeah, I loved the portrayal of women. Now, you mentioned that you don't like to do research in your writing stuff, but of course, not all of your books are set. It was fantastic to see a return to these characters, but you wrote in between a bunch of novels that are set in very different milieus. How do you decide, or how did you decide with those books, what milieu you were going to work in?
Well, there's usually, despite the fact that I hope the novels are funny, it doesn't mean that there isn't a serious goal behind them. So I'm usually writing about an issue that I'm interested in or committed to, and want to shed some light on it. And sometimes it's almost by stealth that I want the reader to understand something about the world, or consider these issues, and perhaps draw some conclusions, maybe for the first time in their minds. So, my my fifth novel, Poles Apart, is my feminist comic novel. My two novels ago, Albatross, is kind of about that tension that exists between success and happiness, and too often we confuse them, that they're the same thing, but they aren't the same thing. So I created a scenario that allowed the reader, not to mention the narrator, to consider the difference between success and happiness and what's really important. And sometimes there are some roots in my own life, often I guess, that prompt such decisions. I mean, I had a 35-year in the public affairs communications consulting business, and I thought I loved my job. Turns out I only liked my job.
Right.
When I wrote my first novel in 2005, it didn't come out till a few years later, but that's when I wrote it. I remember this epiphany that, oh, this is what it feels like to love what you do. And since that revelation, I've been trying to figure out how I could only write.
Right.
And it took until last March, and aided by marrying very well.
Writing is, yes.
So I'm writing full time now.
Yeah.
But which is wonderful and my
great.
dream. But so there, I forget how I got onto that, but there's something I'm usually trying to figure out. You know, my third novel, Up and Down, which also features an older woman, is, you know, it's about Canada-US relations. It's about sexual equality, sexual orientation. It's about, you know, the power of the media. It's about many different things, but it's usually something that has seized me, and I want to kind of explore it and give readers an opportunity to give passing thought to those issues as well.
Well, speaking about your writing career, so I mean, you know, when you started out, I mean, you had a hard time finding a publisher. And I love this story because I think it's a lot of writers go through this. And I mean, there's that, I mean, writing is such a, you know, it seems almost tried to say it, but it's such a hard career to begin with. And even when you're super successful, it's really hard to monetize. So, you know, it's, you know, but you syndicated your first novel, and then it found, so tell us about that journey a little bit and how that happened.
Yeah, well, in a way, in hindsight, it was not surprising that I perhaps had difficulty finding a publisher, because I'd written a satirical novel of Canadian politics. And there's perhaps a reason that there aren't that many satirical novels of Canadian politics in bookstores. But I thought it was more important that I write about something that I knew about, that I understood, that I cared about, and had some, used the word advocacy earlier in a different context, but in a way, I was advocating through this novel for a different path we might take in politics. I thought that was more important than, say, jumping on the vampire novel bandwagon and trying to write a vampire novel, because I couldn't have done that, and it wouldn't have been believable, and it probably would have been a horrible book. So I wrote what I thought I ought to write, even if it wasn't commercially successful. And I spent a year sending out query letters, plot synopses, sample chapters to literary agents and publishers across Canada and down into the United States. And of course, I waited for the feeding frenzy to ensue over my debut blockbuster novel. And I waited and diligently followed up and waited some more. And after a year of doing that, I had received exactly 0 rejection letters. I hadn't made a big enough impression on the traditional publishing establishment to generate an automated rejection letter.
Wow.
So it was a bit discouraging, though I actually wasn't that discouraged. I mean, I was 45 when I wrote it. I had some sense of what it was like to try to break into it, just because the research I had done on the publishing world. So, and, you know, I think I was better equipped at 45 to deal with the silence than I might have been had I been 25 and pinning all of my career hopes on this first novel. I already had I was running my own business at the time with a co-founder of the firm we started. So it was a passion, but I wasn't destroyed by the silence. So it was my wife who finally said, you know, why don't you just self-publish it, just if only to be done with it.
Yeah.
And I didn't know anything about self-publishing. If I had known then what I know now, I'm not sure I would have done it. But I did. I laid down my $1,400 or whatever it was then, and went through the editing process. And as a communications and marketing person, I realized nobody was going to find this self-published novel. It was going to be in no bookstores across the country. They just, you can't get them into bookstores unless you walk them in and foist them on an unsuspecting bookstore manager. So I decided I needed to build an audience for it before it came out, and that's when I came upon the idea of podcasting the novel in its entirety, chapter by chapter, and giving it away for free on iTunes and other podcast repositories. And I tried that. I didn't know at the time that no one had done that in Canada before, but ignorance is sometimes a blessing. And I just went ahead and did it. I was already a podcaster. I'd been podcasting in my day job for almost a year by then. Well, 2 years by then. So I co-hosted a show, a weekly half-hour show on the public relations communications agency world with a colleague. And so I knew I had the technical skills to set up the equipment, record it, add the music, fade out the music, and all the things that I'm sure you are familiar with now too. But so I did that without knowing whether anybody would find it. And if they did find it, would they find favor with it? But it was a shock that people seemed to find it. And I started getting emails and positive comments. Frankly, at the time, I didn't even know whether I had written a novel. I didn't know. You get so close to it. I didn't know whether the characters were believable, whether the story held together, whether it was funny. I just had this faint inkling that it was finished. But the comments I got from people, and I mean, frankly, I wasn't convinced that anyone in Canada would be interested, yet let alone the people I got comments from other parts of the world who somehow found it. And it was I considered it to be the first objective feedback I ever had on the novel, because I didn't believe my wife and my twin brother and my sister-in-law, who said, this is great, but they love me. So am I really going to get the straight goods from them? But the guy in Kuala Lumpur who said, when is the next chapter coming? I must know what happens next. Those comments were extraordinarily gratifying and potent for me as a writer who didn't really know what he was doing. So it was courtesy of those podcast comments that sort of gave me the resolve to go ahead and push the big red button and actually self-publish it and get it out there. And so that's really how it started.
That's really terrific. That's a fantastic story. What do you think? What advice would you give to that kind of 25-year-old writer who is pinning their hopes on it? Because it is so, I always think of it as such a heartbreaking profession. The barrier to entry is really low for the writing part, because you just, but the barrier for entry to getting read is so high.
Yeah, and that's a very good way of putting it, Susan. You're right. It's easier to write it than it is to be read. And I think the advice, if I sort of look back on what happened to me, I just think it's important that people write about something that they deeply care about, that fascinates them, that interests them, that can sustain them through a whole 100,000 word manuscript, and that they not try to leap on to whatever the latest publishing trend is, unless it happens to coincide with something that is meaningful for them. And that the really good books, regardless of what they're about, you hope will somehow find their way to readers. And that was, the blessing in my writing life early on, was that self-published novel somehow miraculously won the Leacock Medal in 2008, which changed my life literally in an instant. And then Canada Reads came along 2 years later. So those two things combined, I think, are really what's largely responsible for whatever modest success my novels have had, because it put them in the hands of more readers than I ever had the right to expect. So I feel like I've exhausted my lifetime allocation of good fortune.
Well, you kind of earn it by writing books that people love. So you give them a lot of happiness.
It was, like neither of us could put it down. So I would recommend anyone watching this to go and buy it. And now I need to go back and read all the other books with the characters in them.
I need to know. Angus, and I guess it's showing up backwards on mine. But I also love the cover. It's very stylish. I love the spy angle. Is a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And I love the way that you drop the references to your previous books so beautifully. And I was like, oh, well, now I need to find out what happened on that tangent. So
I thought that was a bit cheeky on my part. I didn't know whether it would actually make it through the editing process, but that my editor thought it was kind of fun. So we left it in.
Well, where's the Scottish coming from?
Oh, yeah.
Well, it's there's not really much of a story behind that. It's rather pedestrian, but I just thought there might be some comic potential in a thick Scottish accent and the kind of Scottish vernacular that would be fun to explore, but also that someone who speaks the mother tongue might be more likely to be a grammarian. It doesn't come up that often in Operation Angus, but in the first two novels, both Angus and Daniel, the narrator, and I, for that matter, have great reverence for proper use of the language. And there's some fun moments in there where they are, debating one another and correcting others and the proper usage. So, and it was just I just thought it would be kind of fun to do that. So, and if you listen to the early podcast episodes, I really didn't know how to do a Scottish accent. And I think over the years, just by dint of repetition, I think I've figured out. It sounds a little more Scottish now, but I remember a very early reading I did at some festival, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, "Your Angus sounds like a Russian Quebecer." Which was not what I was going for.
Right.
But, anyway.
Ouch. Yeah.
That's funny. So we have less than 3 minutes left. So tell us what's next. Are you going to revive these characters again? Are you going to move to a different location? What's the plan?
Well, my next novel is, well, it's not finished, but the manuscript is with my publisher now. We've done one round of edits, and I'm waiting for the next one to come back. And it's not an Angus and Daniel novel. And it may be it doesn't exactly lend itself to humor quite as easily as some of my other novels, but it's a novel about loss and recovery. It's a novel about Paris in the 1920s.
Wow.
The story is not set in the 20s, but there are echoes from the 20s. It's a story about male friendship. Mm-hmm. We don't have too many novels that examine male friendship and how guys are friends with one another. And there's songwriting in it as well. So I know that feels like a whole disparate cast of elements, but I hope they come together in this novel. And I've had fun with it so far. So we'll see. So that's coming out. It should be coming out this coming August.
Wow.
And the working title is A New Season.
Okay.
Great.
Who knows if it'll survive the editing process, but that's the current title.
Right. Well, I think male friendship is actually a very hot topic. I mean, you read a lot about how men are actually, especially men when they hit a certain age, and women for that part too, are terribly lonely. So, I mean, it's really, and it's interesting. You're right. You don't see a lot of septuagenarian, I'm going to butcher that word right now, heroes. You don't see a lot of books about, middle-aged men and their buddies told in a tender way, I'm assuming.
Right. Well, yeah. And without generalizing, I think women are much better at friendship than men are. We're still kind of locked into the stereotypes of how we're supposed to behave. And I think as we get older, those start to break down a little more. And I mean, I'm doing a lot more hugging of my male friends now than I ever did when I was younger. And
that's so nice. Wow.
Yeah, and I actually have one friend when we greet, he hugs me and then he kisses me on the cheek.
Aww,
and like that's and it didn't feel natural the first time it happened, but a few years later it feels quite natural now. And those are the kinds of, that's a rather simplistic example about it, but it's certainly something that I've noticed over the years, and we need to get better at it. Men need to be better at friendship, I think.
I think that's actually very, very true. A nice antidote to, the toxic masculinity we talk about all the time.
Exactly.
So,
exactly.
Anyway, thank you so much for appearing today. This was really great. Again, Terry Fallis, author of Operation Angus, as well as 7 other best-selling books that you should go out and buy right now.
Yes, there's a great website, terryfallis.com, if you want to learn more about the author and his books.
And his Substack. So don't forget the Substack. So we didn't get to chance to talk about that.
That's because I'm so long-winded.
Well, no, so many great things to talk about. But we'll have you on again if you'll do us the pleasure. And we will tune in. Everyone tune in again next Tuesday. And Susan and I will have someone else to talk to about books. Speak to you again. Bye, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Terry.
Bye.